the small white candle guttered against carved oak, its wax running like pale blood down the altar rail. The smell of incense mixed with a faint metallic tang from unsealed wounds. Outside, the Seine was a slow black ribbon under a sky the color of pewter. Inside the Louvre and the hotels of the city, silk rustled, and men in buff and steel whispered beneath ruffs. It is August in Paris, hot, dusty and fragile. A wedding has been turning the court into a crowded theater where religion, dynastic ambition, and revenge have already claimed props and lines. Within the first hour, the viewer should know 3 uncomfortable truths. First, the massacre that begins on St. Bartholomew's Day was triggered by a narrowly failed political assassination of a Huguenot leader, Admiral Gaspard de Coligny, a fact that turns the scene from sectarian frenzy into courtly calculation. Second, the bloodshed that followed was not the work of one decree read once at the palace. It was the combination of a royal order, local initiative, and mob dynamics that made Paris a map of spontaneous terror. Third, the role of the Queen Mother, Catherine de' Medici, her motives, her culpability, remains debated, with mainstream historians seeing a mix of dynastic fear and opportunism rather than a single cold-blooded mastermind. Hold those 3 truths like knives while we unroll the rope and climb through the windows of history. Let us rewind to the origins of the story. The French wars of religion had been rattling on for 15 years, a succession of fits and counterfeits of siege and treaty. The House of Valois sat on a throne frayed by faction. Catholics rallied under the Guise family, the crown strained to hold its authority, and the Huguenots. Huguenots were French Protestants inspired by Calvin and kept an armed presence in towns and some provinces. The royal wedding on August 18, 1572, between Margaret of Valois, a sister of King Charles IX, and Henry of Navarre, a Protestant prince, was supposed to be a spectacle of reconciliation. The marriage was the visible handshake meant to smother the smouldering war. Paris in late summer smelled of fish from Ile de la Cité markets, of horse sweat and boiled vats of dye, of the turning of pages in prayer books. It also smelled faintly of something else. The fear of a city that had recently hosted soldiers billeted in its streets and that counted bodies from previous skirmishes. The wedding drew a glittering crowd. Bishops in gold, princes in velvet, foreign ambassadors with jeweled chains. Among them came Henry of Navarre and Admiral Coligny, who had been the leading Huguenot military mind and a close advisor to the young prince. Coligny, in the weeks before the wedding, had been pressing for a policy of rapprochement with England and had prominent enemies among the ultra-Catholic faction, especially the Guise brothers. On August 22nd, a shot rang out in the Rue des Tournelles. A stray musket or an intended bullet tore through Coligny's arm, and the nation watched one of its most consequential nobles bleed in the courtyard of the Louvre. Contemporary letters report that Coligny staggered and said something like, "They have not succeeded," a fragment recorded by eyewitnesses who were trying to make sense of whether this was a message, a failed murder, or an accident. The immediate reaction was fury among the Huguenot leaders. Understandable, to be shot in the royal presence felt like a declaration of war. The Huguenot camp bristled with talk of retribution. Here is the first twist most viewers don't expect. The wound to Coligny appears to have been not simply an isolated assault but part of a knot of court intrigues. King Charles IX, a 17-year-old monarch, had been torn between Catholic advisors like the Duke of Anjou and the Guise family, and the more moderate policies some councillors urged. Catherine de' Medici, the Queen Mother, moved like a chess player who had just seen a dangerous knight invade her board. The mainstream view held by many modern historians is that Catherine feared an immediate Huguenot reprisal. If Coligny lived and rallied the Huguenot commanders, the fragile peace from the marriage might shatter into full civil war, and the Valois court would be boxed in. That said, the debate is active. Some historians insist she proactively ordered a massacre. Others argue she gave a tentative sanction only when it seemed the Huguenot threat would topple the court. The evidence is circumstantial: dispatches, diaries, and later confessions, and scholars reconstruct motives from a pattern of moves rather than a signed decree. The second twist. After the shooting of Coligny, the court's atmosphere shifted as if an invisible curtain had fallen. Letters show that Catherine met with the king in the small hours and that a series of immediate orders circulated through the household. There is a record of a council where those gathered discussed the elimination of Huguenot leadership. How literal the word meant at the time is part of the debate, but by dawn on August 24th, St. Bartholomew's Day, strangest of all, the violence erupted through the city with a terrifying improvisational logic. You can picture the start. Bells tolling for matins, shop shutters yet to be raised, the smell of baking bread, and then the first act of concerted violence, attackers entering the streets by house keys and ladders, or by simply forcing doors. The first of the Huguenot deaths occurred near the Louvre in a house where victims had been billeted, men shot in the courtyard, women dragged screaming into the light. The orderly image of a palace order dissolves into the messy business of neighbors, servants, and soldiery deciding who would live. The massacre spread. Boats ferrying attackers to the Ile Saint-Louis where suspected Huguenots had homes, parish priests witnessing citizens dragged from beds and hacked down in churchyards, and marketplaces turned into stages for summary executions. In some places, men in armor led the way. In others, it was teenagers and servants taking the smell of sanctioned violence as permission. Here is the second promise fulfilled. The massacre was not one single blade by one royal hand. It was a matrix of decisions where royal edicts, local initiatives by Catholic city officials, militia, and mobs all fed one another. When the royal watchmen or Swiss guards killed men like Coligny, it gave a signal to neighborhood militias. When Parisian magistrates turned a blind eye or issued ambiguous orders, they legalized rage. One contemporary foreign envoy wrote that the slaughter looked like a general killing, with the king's men leading at times and the populace at others. To understand St. Bartholomew's Day, you must read the massacre as a contagion, an initial lethal act, political sanction that functioned as a green light, and then social dynamics that made each parish an autonomous unit of atrocity. This is also where the worst rumors and the strangest anecdotes enter the scene. A monk from Lyon later claimed to have seen bodies carried into the Tournelle prison, and of thieves looting the dead. A Protestant pamphlet insisted Paris had seen rivers of blood. The contemporary Catholic record was different. Some clergy rejoiced and the papal court issued medals praising the massacre. Pope Gregory XIII reportedly ordered a Te Deum in celebration. That reaction tells you something about the interpretation of the event by different parties. For Catholics, it was deliverance. For Huguenots, it was slaughter. Modern historians stress both the propaganda warfare that followed and the difficulties in reconstructing exact numbers. Contemporary estimates ranged wildly. Mainstream modern reckoning places Paris casualties in the low thousands and nationwide deaths at roughly 5 to 10,000, lower than some eyewitness claims, higher than royal denials. Scholars caution that contemporary pamphlets, especially those produced by refugees, inflated figures for political effect, while royal records minimized them. Let us zoom into a set piece. The murder of Admiral Coligny. Wounded on the 22nd, he was hauled to his lodgings and later to a small house under guard. On the morning of the 24th, a party of armed men entered his room. Some accounts say he was hacked with swords and then thrown out a window. Others say he was shot and then stabbed. The most reliable contemporary notes indicate that he was finally found dead in a ditch and that his body was mutilated. Reports vary because eyewitnesses were fleeing and scribes often borrowed details from rumor. Still, Coligny's death became a symbol, the killing of a moderate military mind who had, in the eyes of many, been a possible mediator and a figure who might have prevented further war. If you had a camera that morning, it would have captured the silence that fell when the news of his murder reached the Huguenot camps. The air seemed to thicken with dread into a tangible thing. There are moments of grim, human detail that history keeps insisting we look at. In one recorded scene, a woman named Renée de Rieux is said to have been dragged from her bed and forced to eat a communion wafer she had hidden, an act of mockery and humiliation that fused religious symbolism with personal cruelty. In another, a craftsman knocked on a Protestant neighbor's door to demand keys, and then used a candle to find names written in a prayer book, the pages of which would be used as evidence or torches. These images are small but terrible because they show how religious ritual and domestic life become instruments of violence. They are also why law matters. Parisian municipal statutes gave officials broad authority in times of public emergency. Those statutes could be read as enabling harsh measures against perceived heretics. Becoming more precise, the massacre spread beyond Paris in waves. In the weeks after August 24th, killings occurred in cities across France, Orléans, Rouen, Troyes, and Lyon among them. In some towns, the violence was brutal but quick. In others, it smoldered, swelling into months. Local governors who feared Huguenot garrisons used the royal signal to purge opponents. Some Protestant communities were burned or expelled. Yet the carnage was uneven. In many places, governors protected Huguenots either from conviction of their innocence or out of fear for civil order. This patchwork response underscores a key truth about early modern governance. Authority was thin and reliant on local magistrates' choices. In some towns, the violence was brutal but quick. In others, it smoldered, swelling into months. Local governors who feared Huguenot garrisons used the royal signal to purge opponents. Some Protestant communities were burned or expelled. Yet the carnage was uneven. In many places, governors protected Huguenots, either from conviction of their innocence or out of fear for civil order. This patchwork response underscores a key truth about early modern governance. Authority was thin and reliant on local magistrates' choices. When royal will was ambiguous, Local actors filled the gap. One major long-term consequence is often overlooked in dramatic retellings. The massacre accelerated the disappearance of an earlier form of religious coexistence in France. For decades before 1572, pockets of negotiation, intermarriage and commercial interaction had allowed Huguenots and Catholics to coexist unevenly. After St. Bartholomew's Day, the perception of threat hardened. Huguenot communities either armed more fully or fled abroad. Protestant leaders became more convinced that compromise was lethal, and Catholic hardliners felt emboldened. The massacre fed a spiral of polarization that would fuel the next phases of the French Wars of Religion and shape political thought about toleration in Europe. And because this is a story of kings and dynastic calculations, we must return to Charles IX and Catherine de' Medici. Officially, the royal court justified the killings as a preemptive strike to preserve order against Huguenot revenge for Colignew's shooting. The mainstream historical view tends to treat Catherine as the person who, in the heat of fear and counsel, allowed radical measures, what recent historians call contingent sanction, rather than as a diabolical mastermind who sought wholesale slaughter. The evidence includes letters from ambassadors who reported the Queen Mother's mood, and straws like the issuance of certain orders and the general handing of authority to loyal troops. However, the debate continues. Some revisionist scholars argue for a stronger version of premeditation, pointing at the swiftness of coordinated killings in other cities as evidence of central planning. Others note the absence of a single written command, and argue for a more accidental, improvisational interpretation. Honest history sits with the tension. It acknowledges Catherine's responsibility without settling the argument as to whether she penned an explicit death sentence. A different, quieter truth sits in the margins. Ordinary Parisian citizens found themselves unexpectedly in positions of power. A baker or a guildmaster might be thrust into a role as an arbiter of life and death by virtue of proximity or rumor. A parish priest could use the pulpit to encourage or to restrain. Many did a mixture of both. Social networks mattered. Relations across neighborhoods, godparent ties and long-established debt obligations sometimes saved people. In at least one recorded instance, a Catholic shopkeeper hid a Huguenot client in his cellar until the violence subsided. Those acts of small mercy remind us that mass events are not purely monolithic. Human choices ripple amid the headline events. Now, before we get to the most unforgettable, often cited detail of the aftermath, a necessary aside, the one detail that resonates across centuries is this. The massacre produced not only corpses, but a currency of memory, a political weapon used for decades by both sides. The Huguenots commemorated the event in sermons and pamphlets as the epitome of Catholic treachery. Catholics celebrated as deliverance from heresy. Across Europe, the massacre altered reputations. Elizabethan England, Protestant and watchful, used it as proof of Catholic barbarity. The papacy awarded medals, and merchants recalculated alliances and markets. More tangibly, the massacre's legacy is paradoxical. It temporarily bolstered the Catholic front and weakened moderate parties, but it also radicalized Huguenots and set the stage for further cycles of violence that exhausted the kingdom. The turbulence culminated in the War of the Three Henrys 1587 to 1589, the assassination of Henry III, the rise of Henry of Navarre, and eventually the Edict of Nantes in 1598, which granted limited toleration to Protestants. So the massacre is part of a chain. It was a brutal accelerant, making future conciliation more costly, and yet the political system found ways, often imperfect and delayed, to re-seek stability. Catherine's name carried an aura of Machiavellian calculation. Contemporaries and later writers cast her in various lights, from calculating mother to scapegoat. Charles IX's later madness and death at 23 fed a tragic narrative, while Coligny emerged as a martyr in Huguenot memory. These reputational aftershocks mattered. They shaped how later memoirists recounted the event and how historians framed it in national narratives about sectarian violence and royal responsibility. The massacre also left legal and administrative traces. Municipal orders changed, the watch system in Paris was revised, and the crown adjusted the practice of billeting soldiers in towns. Monarchs learned that the mixing of armed factions within a city during a royal ceremony could be volatile, and new protocols were gradually developed to manage such intersections of military and court life. Scholars of legal history point to these practical changes as evidence of how atrocity forces institutional reform. There are quieter lessons too. The danger of political language that blurs prevention and extermination. The way rumor and rumor's amplification can make an ambiguous order read as permission for atrocity. And the role of proximity. When courts, markets, and houses are interwoven, violence travels like a contagion. The St. Bartholomew's Day massacre thus offers a grim modern lesson. Legal and rhetorical ambiguity plus a single violent act in a tightly packed social space can create a spiral that no single actor then controls. Finally, how do historians balance empathy, accuracy, and the need to avoid sensationalism? The mainstream approach treats the massacre as a fact of political violence that must be analysed through multiple lenses. Diplomatic dispatches, parish records, legal documents, and refugee testimony. Where sources conflict, historians indicate the majority interpretation and the nature of the dispute. In public retellings, it is ethical to speak plainly about atrocity while being careful with numbers, and with the temptation to ascribe cinematic villainy to a single person without evidence. So what are we left with as we stand in that damp August air? A city of candles and blood, of wedding finery smeared with grief, where dynastic calculation and popular violence braided together, a king who was young and terrified, a mother who feared for the dynasty, nobles who plotted and prayed, ordinary people who were both perpetrators and saviors. 3 uncomfortable truths we promised have been kept. The assassination attempt that lit the fuse, the complex mix of royal sanction and local agency, and the continuing debate over Catherine's role. This is history that resists moral simplicity, yet it demands moral attention, and its echo is in modern politics, when sectarian identities become political fault lines, and when legal authority is ambiguous, societies produce moments that look a lot like August 1572. The human details, Coligny's wound, a stolen prayer book, a baker hiding a neighbour, are the points of light that keep us from turning the past into a single moral cartoon. They ask us to hold both horror and humanity in our hands. If you have followed this thread and want the next chapter, how Henry of Navarre's conversion and the Edict of Nantes tried to stitch the kingdom back together, subscribe and I will guide you through the documents, the treaties, and the stubborn people who made peace and then remade it. For now, close by picturing the candle that began this account melted to a stub, its wick curled like a question mark. The stain on the altar rail can be washed, the statutes reworded, and the court can recompose itself. But memory remains. The massacre travelled beyond the capital to embitter provinces, to reshape political alliances, and to enter the vocabulary of European confessional conflict. It is a reminder that when a kingdom's legitimacy is precarious and rumour finds purchase, terrible things can happen fast. In the end, St. Bartholomew's Day is not merely a tale of slaughter. It is a story about decision-making under pressure, the dangers of ambiguous commands, and the human capacity for both cruelty and rescue. It is an event where kings, queens, and clergy met head-on with ordinary people, and where law, ritual, and war blurred. Studied in archives and argued over in seminar rooms, it remains a stark episode in the longue durée of early modern Europe, a cautionary tale as relevant as it is tragic.